There are days in the life of the Church that pass softly, quietly, like a candle burning in some forgotten chapel corner, days that feel like nothing more than the slow breath of history turning one page into the next. And then there are days that erupt, not with the noise of drums or the thunder of battles, but with a force so deep and unexpected that you only understand what hit you when the shockwave finally arrives. This is one of those days, because on the 60th anniversary of the closing of the Second Vatican Council, while most of the world moved through December as if it were any other month, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, theologian, former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a man whose academic spine has never bent under pressure, released an intervention that landed like lightning in the bloodstream of the Church. He pointed a finger. And not at the usual suspects. Not at the progressive theologians who have spent decades rewriting doctrine the way a decorator rearranges furniture. Not at the liturgical innovators who treat the altar like a stage. Not at those who bend Catholic identity in favor of whatever ideology is trending. No. On the most symbolic day, the day the Council closed in 1965, the day Paul VI once described as the building of a bridge between the Church and the modern world, Müller turned around and pointed his finger at the group many least expected. He pointed at the Traditionalists. And the way he said it did not come with whispers or politeness. He didn't soften his language. He didn't spare reputations. He said out loud the things some bishops would not even dare to mention behind closed doors. He said what progressives have been praying someone of his authority would finally say. He said what wounded, shocked, confused, and even angered the same people who once counted him among their intellectual defenders. And yet, hidden within the sting of his words was something uncomfortable that even his critics had to acknowledge. He wasn't just criticizing. He was diagnosing. He was performing open-heart surgery on the Church's internal wounds, and like all surgeries, it hurt. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. It all begins with a premise so simple, so classical, so recognizable to every Orthodox Catholic that no one in their right mind would object to it. The Second Vatican Council never intended to announce something new. It intended to communicate the same unchanging revelation of Christ using new expressions, drawing from the organic unity between faith, liturgy, and the life of the Church. If Müller had stopped there, the 60th anniversary event would have been a respectful theological reflection. Everyone would have nodded politely. But he didn't stop there. He went deeper, into the battleground of interpretations, into the place where Catholics have been fighting each other for more than 60 years. And there, he delivered his first strike. Müller wrote that over the last 6 decades, the Council has been distorted by 2 opposing misreadings, a progressive misreading and a traditionalist misreading. Of course, everyone expected the first. Progressives have long used Vatican II as license to soften doctrine, reshape the liturgy, and reinterpret Catholicism through the mood of the times. Müller has spent his life fighting that. But when he turned and directed his next sentence at traditionalists, the entire Catholic world felt a jolt. He claimed that some in the traditionalist world have fallen into an ideological trap, treating the liturgy as theatrical beauty, reducing tradition to cultural aesthetics, and even using the Council as a pretext to resist ecclesiastical authority. This hit like a punch to the chest. Many of the faithful have spent decades defending reverence when everyone else walked away from it. They were the ones kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament when others stopped. They kept chants alive when parishes replaced them with casual music. They preserved vestments and sacred silence. They guarded the beauty that others abandoned. They kept the fasts, the confession lines, the Latin prayers, the old devotions. And yet here was Müller, accusing them of distortion. Was it exaggeration? Unfairness? A necessary wake-up call? Whatever the interpretation, the accusation landed. And the sting was sharper because it came from him. Müller is not a progressive. He has spent decades defending orthodoxy. He has challenged theologians, bishops, and even papal advisors when they drifted. So when someone known for defending tradition turns and critiques traditionalists, the impact is enormous. But here's the twist that defies easy categorization: Müller wasn't simply striking at traditionalist extremes. He was diagnosing something deeper, something that affects the whole Church. He was saying, faith cannot become ideology, not progressivism, not conservatism, not liturgical aesthetics. Faith is revelation. Faith is communion. Faith is Christ. And whenever the faith becomes a weapon, a badge, a club, or an identity marker, something sacred is lost. Yet this diagnosis raises a more profound question: why choose the 60th anniversary of the Council to direct such heavy criticism at the traditionalists, the small group still filling seminaries, still teaching catechesis, still kneeling, still fasting, still defending orthodoxy? Why them? Why now? To answer that, we must acknowledge something Müller surely knows: the collapse of Western Christianity did not come from traditionalists. Churches did not empty because of Latin chants. Vocations did not die because of incense. Catechesis did not collapse because of reverent silence. No honest historian blames the reverence of a few kneeling Catholics for the crisis. The collapse came from something else, from progressive abuse of the Council, from moral confusion, from treating theology as sociology, from priests turning homilies into activism. Müller knows this. He condemns it openly. He calls this reinterpretation of the Council a falsification, a betrayal of the deposit of faith. So again, why does he critique traditionalists more sharply than the progressives responsible for the collapse? The answer lies in a tension that has been building for decades. Müller believes both extremes feed each other. Progressives justify their deviations by saying traditionalists are rigid and closed to modern man. Traditionalists justify their anger by pointing to the chaos created by progressives. Each side strengthens the other. Each believes the other is the reason the Church is wounded. And Müller, standing in the middle of these two factions, is trying to warn both: if you turn the Council into ideology, you lose Christ. If you turn tradition into identity politics, you lose Christ. If you turn reform into rupture, you lose Christ. If you turn liturgy into rebellion, you lose Christ. His call is simple: do not pick sides. Return to the center, to the Eucharist, the cross, and the unchanging revelation of Christ. But this raises another question: if progressives are the ones who caused the crisis, why does his language land hardest on the traditionalists? Maybe he sees something forming, something not yet visible but potentially dangerous. Maybe he fears the traditionalist movement could harden into a faction. Maybe he sees the early hints of ideological purity. Maybe he wants to prevent a future schism. Or maybe, some argue, he misunderstands the motivations of the traditionalist world entirely. Because here's another truth: traditionalists didn't ask for this war. They simply refused to surrender the sacred. They held on to beauty when beauty was mocked. They kept reverence when reverence was unpopular. They kept discipline when discipline collapsed. They clung to the ancient rites not out of nostalgia but out of love. This is why Müller's accusations cut so deeply. But to understand his point, we must return to the heart of his argument. He fears that some may turn the liturgy into identity, not consciously, not maliciously, but subtly. He fears the sacred can be used as a weapon. He fears tradition can become an ideology. He fears worship can become a statement. And when worship becomes a statement, the encounter with God fades behind the message. However, this raises a painful counter-question: where was this intensity when progressive bishops dismantled doctrine? Where was this boldness when Eucharistic reverence disappeared? Where was this fire when catechesis was replaced with self-help? Traditionalists endured humiliation for decades while others introduced experiments that confused millions. And now, when the Church is desperate for renewal, Müller scolds the only group still alive. This is why the traditional world felt his words like betrayal. But the Cardinal is not blind. He does not deny that progressives caused the crisis. He openly condemns their misuse of the Council. He calls their movements distortions. So then why is he harder on traditionalists? The answer lies in this: progressivism is already exposed. It is already bearing its rotten fruit. Everyone sees the empty seminaries, the closed churches, the collapsing religious orders. But the traditionalist movement is growing. It is vibrant. It has young families, vocations, life. And Müller fears that this life could be poisoned by ideology. He wants to purify the movement before it grows into something divisive. He wants to save it from becoming a mirror image of the progressive distortions. He sees hope in it, and he wants that hope to remain pure. Still, traditionalists have their own legitimate questions. Why trust leaders who abandoned the altars? Why trust theologians who confused generations? Why trust structures that allowed liturgical chaos for decades? Müller's response is simple and difficult at the same time: unity is not optional. Tradition without communion becomes rebellion. Reverence without obedience becomes spectacle. The Church is not saved by tribes but by Christ. This is Müller's burden. He is trying to reconcile two worlds that hate each other. His fight is not against Vatican II, it is against the misuse of Vatican II. His fight is not against the Latin Mass, it is against turning the Mass into ideology. He believes the Church's division comes not from the Council but from the interpretation of the Council. Progressives interpreted it as rupture, some traditionalists interpret it as mistake. But Müller insists it must be interpreted as continuity lived in doctrine, worship, and life. But the question remains: is he right? Or is he striking the wrong target? Is he healing the Church, or hurting the only faithful remnant left? Because this is more than a theological commentary. This is a confrontation with the soul of the Church. Has the Church lost its center, or is it rediscovering it? And who will pay the price during that rediscovery? To feel the weight of Müller's intervention, we must look at the Church not as ideas, but as wounds. For 60 years, Catholics have been fighting a silent war. Not with violence, but with interpretations. The Church is one body, but that body is bruised. Some wounds came from outside: atheism, secularism, cultural decay. But the deepest wounds came from within. Bishops contradicting bishops. Priests arguing with priests. Theologians rewriting foundations. Liturgies losing identity. Moral theology dissolving into emotional slogans. Parishes becoming community centers rather than places of worship. Whole nations quietly drifting away from the sacraments. In the middle of this wounded Church, Müller drops his intervention. And the reaction is explosive, especially among traditionalists, a community that sees itself as survivors holding candles in a storm. They preserved what everyone else abandoned. They protected the sacred when reverence was mocked. They raised families in the faith at a time when many abandoned the faith entirely. And now, suddenly, they are the ones being corrected? You can imagine the emotional reaction: we guarded what you abandoned. We preserved what you neglected. We held the treasures of the Church through mockery and exile. How are we now the threat? Yet Müller sees a danger forming, a danger many refuse to acknowledge. He sees a temptation to pride, the temptation to believe, we alone are the real Catholics. We alone are the remnant. This pride can cloak itself in incense, chant, ritual, discipline. It can whisper during the creed. It can hide behind reverence. And Müller fears that if this pride grows, the movement he loves will become the seed of a new schism. The Church has seen this pattern before. Movements born out of love for the faith slipping into rebellion. Müller recognizes the early signs. But while he warns traditionalists about pride, he also warns progressives about something far darker, apostasy. He knows progressive theology has hollowed out the Church. He condemns it openly. Everything collapsing today, empty pews, abandoned sacraments, collapsing vocations, grew out of progressive misinterpretations of the Council. Traditionalists did not cause the collapse, progressives did. And Müller knows this. So again, why is he harsher on the traditionalists? Because progressivism has already destroyed itself. Its fruit is visible. But the traditionalist movement is alive, and thus capable of becoming either the beginning of renewal or the beginning of a rupture. Müller sees both possibilities. And he is terrified of the latter. He wants to save the movement from internal corrosion. Yet the story of the Church is not just the story of two factions. It is the story of a bride wounded by her own children. The progressives wounded the Church by abandoning doctrine. Some traditionalists wounded her by abandoning charity. Both sides wounded her by losing sight of the center, Christ. And Müller is fighting for that center. The heart of his message is painful but simple: the Council must be interpreted in continuity, not rupture. Tradition must be lived, not idolized. The liturgy must be worship, not theater. Authority must be respected, not weaponized. And faith must be Christ, not ideology. His intervention is a fire, a warning, a plea, a wound, and a hope. It reveals the fractures within the Church. It exposes the dangers on both sides. It attempts to pull the Church back to her center, before the fractures become permanent. The question that remains is the question every Catholic must wrestle with: will the Church rediscover its center, or continue drifting into factions? And who will suffer most during that rediscovery? If this message touched your heart, comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.